Alright everybody, The Chosen Season 3, Episode 6 has released, so let's get to the breakdown. The episode opens on a dark, foggy night, with a snake slithering past the sleeping disciples as Jesus prays a stone's throw away. As the snake approaches, Jesus pounds the ground and turns around. Claudia Procula, wife of Pontius Pilate, sits up in her bed, confused by the strange dream. The episode doesn't tell us her name, but that's her name according to tradition, so until we're told otherwise, that's the name I'm going to call her. She steps outside and is disgusted at the sight of men being crucified. When she voices her displeasure, Pilate says to leave the governing to him and tells her to go back to bed. Claudia says she hasn't been sleeping well. He says he's going to meet an old friend, and she notices that snake on his armband as he clothes himself and kisses her before leaving. The opening credits roll. Back in Galilee, the apostles have gathered outside Capernaum, where they are sharpening their knives. When Matthew asks why they're doing so, they begin to voice their growing confusion over exactly what they're supposed to be doing or what they're going to have to do in the future. The events from the last episode have left them a bit shaken up, and they think that having weapons would be useful going forward. Some argue that they should have never allowed the woman to get as close to Jesus as they did, while others argue that if she hadn't gotten close, she would have never gotten healed. The group teases Simon about spending time with Gaius, and when Matthew hears this, he warmly states that Gaius isn't an evil man. Some argue that spending time with a Roman might hurt their reputation, but Philip points out that Jesus doesn't seem to care much about reputation. Matthew asks if he should be sharpening weapons, but Simon says that Matthew already has the sharpest weapon of all, his mind. Still, he helps Matthew learn how to use a knife. Nathaniel asks Z why he's sharpening a dagger rather than a normal knife, but Z says he doesn't know if he can trust Nathaniel with that information. He admits to little James that members of his former order are after him. James says that he shouldn't solve problems with a dagger anymore, and when Z voices his concerns of putting Jesus in danger, James says to leave that up to Jesus. Quintus tells Gaius that Atticus is tattling on him to Pilate in Jerusalem, and that if he is to be promoted, he needs Pilate's endorsement. He says Gaius is failing in Tent City. He suggests that the easiest solution is to kill Jesus, but the revolt that would follow would make things more difficult. Instead, he tells Gaius to do whatever it takes to make Tent City too dark, cold, and miserable for the pilgrims to want to stay. Gaius says that he knows what he must do. That night, a young man named Leander sneaks into Andrew's house, waking Andrew, Philip, and Judas. Leander explains that Andrew and Philip's mission to the Decapolis made everything go haywire, and everyone's at one another's throats. At the same time, he says people are hungry for Jesus' teaching and insists that they return with him to finish their mission. When Tamar can tell that Mary is giving her the cold shoulder, she asks Mary if everything's okay between them. Mary criticizes Tamar for being rude to Zebedee, but when Tamar says that she was trying to advance their ministry, Mary points out that they have more to contribute than just financial needs. Tamar sarcastically says Mary always knows the right thing to say, and Mary lashes out, pointing out that whereas Tamar's first experience with Jesus involved him complimenting her faith, Mary's first experience with Jesus was when she was in a bar, drunk. She says they're supposed to be more humble and that she's constantly reminded of her own brokenness. Tamar asks why she can't see how amazing she is, and Mary rebuts that maybe they aren't supposed to be focusing on themselves at all. She struggles to understand Tamar's sense of entitlement and criticizes her gallivanting around, ignorant of their people's pain, and doing everything perfectly. Tamar interprets Mary's words as being triggered by shame and says she is sorry that Mary continues holding on to it. She explains that she came from a war-torn country and that her parents died before her eyes, and explains that the necklace she wears has been passed down from generation to generation and contains her mother's blood on it. Mary helps her tie the necklace back on and explains that she lost her father too. They reconcile and plan to go on a walk to meet with local vineyard owners to discuss how to develop good soil. They both say that they could learn a lot from one another. Atticus arrives in Jerusalem, where Pilate greets him and welcomes him into his tent. They discuss Quintus, who Pilate recalls was reprimanded for his use of excess force in the region of his employ. Atticus explains that Quintus is the type of man who wants to be remembered, and Pilate says that makes them very different from one another. He's also been reprimanded for his use of force, and if Quintus is getting in trouble too, that means he has to use even less force. He says he wants to learn more about what brought Atticus to Capernaum. Zebedee comes across Mary and Tamar, who are working on developing better soil. They ask Zebedee to get the disciples together to help them with their task, but he says he isn't sure that he has that sort of authority over them. They also ask him to get the disciples together to go purchase some things for them, but he explains that he isn't sure if he has enough money. Mary goes upstairs to retrieve the ministry's purse of money for Zebedee to use. In Matthew's old room, she comes across a container with his tzitzit in them, and she handles them curiously before finding the purse and heading back downstairs. Atticus tells Pilate about Jesus. Pilate says he is content in ruling in Judea and has even grown to love the people, except for the high priest Caiaphas. He says he wants peace for the people to get what they want, for Rome to be sated. He asks Atticus to keep track of Jesus and says that he will take his counsel regarding him because, unlike Quintus, he understands Atticus' interests. He tells him to learn all he can. Simon futilely tries to compliment Eden on her food and presents, but they're interrupted when James and John knock on the door. They explain that 2 disciples of John the Baptist are seeking Jesus. Andrew's visit was over a month ago, and they have something they wish to convey. Andrew and Philip, meanwhile, have returned to the Decapolis. Simon says it can wait until morning, but when he comes back inside, Eden has retreated to her room. The next morning, the Sons of Thunder guide Simon to John's disciples, who prove their identities through a series of questions. He asks them what their message is. In Tent City, Z catches the Zealots watching them. Though he tries to escape, he finds himself surrounded on all sides with nowhere to go. At the same time, Gaius walks through Tent City, intentionally disobeying Quintus's commands and smiling as he ties a fisherman's knot before having a seeming moment of realization. Rather than making life more complicated for the pilgrims, he goes out of his way to help them. Z places his hands against his chest, begins to pray, and falls to his knees. He says they can kill him, but they can't take his life away. He joined the order to await the Messiah's coming, but now that the Messiah is here, he doesn't need to be a zealot anymore. He says that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and that the Messiah isn't what they thought he would be, saying that he bet his life on it, giving up his sikha and his way of life after seeing the Messiah heal his brother. A crowd begins to gather around Jesus when he returns to Capernaum, and he doesn't waste any time to begin healing people, one person after the other. He helps a lame man walk, a blind boy see, and a mute man speak. When the mute man begins to pray to Jesus as God, Jesus doesn't deny the assertion, but says to save those titles for later. Simon brings John's disciples to Jesus, who recognizes them from his own baptism by John. They say that their question would best be made in private, but Jesus has the crowd welcome his disciples, informs them about John's imprisonment, and says that hearing from John in such a trying time would be instructive and healthy for all. The baptizer sent them to ask if he was really the one to come or if they should look for someone else. He's heard about Jesus' message in Nazareth and asks why he is still in prison when Jesus came to proclaim liberty to the captives. Jesus says that there is more than just physical captivity to deal with. He tells them to tell John that the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the mute speak, and the poor have the good news preached to them, and that people are blessed if they aren't offended by him. The local Pharisee objects to this, calling Jesus a blasphemer and a sorcerer who publicly disrespected him and is mastered by an evil spirit. Jesus tells John's disciples to add to their list that the dead are raised as well, and that he loves John. Jesus tells the crowd about how amazing John is, yet even he had questions. He asks them what they went out in the wilderness to see, a reed shaken by the wind, a person adorned in fine clothing, or a prophet. He says that John fulfilled the words of the prophets, and that he is the greatest of all humans born of women. The Pharisee objects to this, calling John demon-possessed and offended by his labeling his fellow Pharisees as vipers. Jesus says nothing in response. He explains to the crowd that even the least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than John, something John himself would agree with. He tells them not to waste the time that they have now to receive the truth he has for them, that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and even looks the Pharisee in the eyes and says, "Don't miss it." He says that the crowds are like unappeasable children who are always seeking yet never satisfied, calling John demon-possessed for all that he did, and calling Jesus a drunkard for doing the opposite. It doesn't matter what's put in front of them, they'll reject it. He says wisdom is justified by her works, and just as the Pharisee is about to say something, Jairus cuts in and reminds everyone of Quintus's edict that groups of 25 or more could not gather in the evening. Gaius supports this and dismisses the crowd. The Zealots are shaken up by what they've seen, though not all of them to the same degree. Their leader rejects Z's offers to join them, but says he will return to the order with the truth. Simon the Zealot is dead. Barnaby approaches Jesus and asks him to heal Shula, who admits that she wouldn't ask for herself. Jesus applauds her and Barnaby for their faith and tells her that she sees better than most in the region, then places his hands over her eyes and prays. She's afraid to open her eyes, but she does so, being entirely healed. It had been 10 years. Barnaby says that he is fine without healing, and Jesus says that maybe he'll heal him another time. As they depart, however, Barnaby realizes that Jesus has healed him too, and he excitedly wraps Jesus up in a big old bear hug. They hoop and holler as they depart. That evening, Simon enters the house excitedly, recapping the events of the day. But Eden comes out and admits that she lost their baby. Simon didn't even know that she was with child, and asks why she didn't tell him. She explains that she didn't want to distract him or make him regret following Jesus, but she didn't know the pain would go on so long. He says that she should have told him and voices frustration at the fact that he had thought he had done something wrong. She says that the issue is that he didn't do anything at all, never asking about how she'd been. She says that she's been loving toward him all this time but didn't realize how much time his ministry would be taking up. He says that he had no way of knowing what had been going on and that he couldn't read her mind, and she admits that she hasn't always been right in how she's handled things. He suggests that maybe she was upset by him going on the mission in the first place, and while she says not to put words in her mouth, he says that maybe he shouldn't have gone on the mission at all. But she says to leave Jesus out of it. It isn't his problem. Simon says that he's the Messiah. If it isn't his problem, whose is it? He kneels on the ground, and she comes down and comforts him, neither knowing the proper words to speak. Man, oh man, a whole lot happened in this episode. There's a lot of plot threads that have been building up and interweaving throughout the season that came to a head in this episode, primarily those regarding Mary and Tamar, Simon and Eden, and Z with the Zealots. I think this episode single-handedly provided us with the most nuanced conversations I've ever seen in television thus far, with Mary and Tamar and Simon and Eden's conversations in particular being so real and laced with nuance that none of those four characters are perfectly in the right or in the wrong with anything they said. It was good to see everyone finally communicating with one another, because we've been waiting for that a while now, and it's nice to see things being put out in the open, and it's really cool to see the further development of the theme of reconciliation that were planted way back in the first 2 episodes of the season. The Mary and Tamar storyline wasn't one of my favorite ones, and while I think I see where they were going with it, I still think that the two women have a lot more they need to work through. That conversation in particular was probably the most complex conversation we've had thus far in the show. Almost every line spoken by one woman to the other contained something that seemed partly correct, partly incorrect, but if this is the resolution to that storyline, I'm not totally sure how satisfying that is. The way it ended seemed like things are supposed to be resolved going forward, but there are some underlying issues and ideological differences between the women that I hope are addressed in the future. Mary's resentment towards Tamar seemed to come out of nowhere, which is in many ways true to how things happen like this in life, and while Tamar's story is touching and heartbreaking, it felt very odd how it totally changed Mary's mind, as if Jesus only calls us to sacrifice things we don't have emotional attachments to. In many ways, I'm not sure it totally conveyed the message that it was supposed to convey. I need to sit back and think about that scene a little bit more before I can comment any further. The Simon and Eden conflict, on the other hand, was handled really, really well. It felt very true to life, and while I think there were still a lot of things that need to be said between the two, where we left them off at the end of the episode, as heartbreaking as it may be, is actually more satisfying, in my opinion, to the overall plotline than the resolution is with Mary and Tamar. I'm sure that these plot points will still play a part in the episodes to come, but that's where I stand for now. One last issue I did have is that the chronology of this show continues to confuse me a bit, because we have confirmation in this episode that Andrew's visit to John the Baptist in prison took place a little over a month earlier. Last episode told us that Eden's miscarriage was 2 weeks earlier, which means that the events of episodes 1 through 5 all took place in the span of 2 to 3 weeks, including their downtime in Capernaum, Jesus' return and commissioning of the 12, the departure of the 12 on their 2x2 mission, and Eden's pregnancy and miscarriage. That's a whole lot of stuff. It would also mean that the disciples were gone for far less time on this mission than they were in the previous season, because we know that from the events of season 2 episode 4, the Feast of Tabernacles, and season 3 episode 3, Rosh Hashanah, 11 months have passed. I'm just having difficulty in figuring out exactly how long these events are supposed to transpire over, especially because they're making it seem like they were gone for a lot longer on their 2x2 mission than they were on the previous time, whereas chronologically speaking, it doesn't seem like that's exactly the case. It actually seems like they were only gone for a few weeks, which also wouldn't really seem to allow for all the different developments to have happened in between those episodes in between that time. So I'm just kind of confused by all that. I don't want to end on a negative note, though, so let me say what I loved about this episode, because I really did like this episode quite a bit. First off, like I already mentioned before, the conversations were top-notch, and the conclusions to many ongoing storylines were absolutely great. The biblical stuff, with the miracles and the discussion with John the Baptist's disciples, was about as perfect as I can imagine it, and that scene with Barnaby and Shula was probably the best part of the whole episode, one that we've been waiting for since the 2nd episode of season 1. I really did enjoy this episode, and the opening scene with Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane is probably my favorite opening scene that they've had in any of the episodes so far in the whole show, and I'm really excited to see where they're heading with that, especially with the development of Pilate's wife and her recurring dreams. So there's definitely a whole lot to love in this episode, and I really, really did like it. Before we wrap up this video, though, I wanted to make a quick announcement. After season 3 finishes airing, I'm hoping to begin a series walking through the Gospel of Matthew. If you've been subscribed to this channel for a while, you'll know that I was doing a series through the book of Isaiah, and while we made it to chapter 39, I'm actually wanting to hit the brakes on that series for a while so that we can start focusing on the Gospels, because those videos will probably have a lot more cross-pollination with people who come to this channel for videos on The Chosen, since it's specifically focusing on the Gospels. I'll give y'all more details about that series in the coming weeks, but just wanted to let y'all know about it so you can start getting excited and so you can make sure that you're subscribed to the channel so you know when those videos start coming out. I'm really, really excited to walk through the Gospel of Matthew with y'all as we await the arrival of season 4. Other than that, be sure to let me know what you thought about this episode in the comments down below. If you haven't done so already, be sure to leave a like on this video so YouTube knows that videos like this are worth watching. And as I mentioned a second ago, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you know when other videos like this are coming your way. Until next time, I'm David Tate, and this is Now Let's Be Honest. Be sure to keep a smile on your face and don't let anybody steal your joy. See y'all later.
You read a verse, you sing a hymn, the money's in the plate. Sundays you mark out for him, but even then you show up late. You bought the shirt, you wear the cross, but sin throughout the week. For 30 shekels and a noose, you kiss him on the cheek.